Hi everyone, welcome to the second half of Chapter 5 on civil rights. We'll be talking about the women's rights movement today. So I want to split this up into two sections. Firstly, what is feminism? I think we need to start off with a primer on feminism just so we're all on the same page. And then secondly, we'll talk about what value the feminist lens adds to political science or the study of American government particularly. So we'll be understanding feminism in a nutshell. And then we'll look a little bit more closely at the women's rights movement that your book highlights in the second part of Chapter 5. So first let's start with some basic ideas. Who is a feminist? Well, a basic definition is anyone who believes in the political, social, and economic equality of men and women. If you believe in equality, you are a feminist. Man, woman, person, dog, cat, peanut butter, it doesn't matter, you are a feminist. And don't let anyone tell you differently. Feminism is very diverse. There are many strands. Many people say that there are many feminisms, plural, but there are some unifying ideas. Feminism is, firstly, not just about women, though they are, of course, a huge part of it. Feminist research in political science, for instance, started about 30-40 years ago with the question, where are the women in international politics? So women, of course, are important, but feminism actually focuses on the role of gender, how gender is defined and how it affects the way we behave, the way we view ourselves and the world. It's important to understand the difference between sex and gender. Sex is membership in a biological category, usually one of two. It's basically hormones, your reproductive or sex organs, your genetic makeup. It's checking a box at the doctor's office, right? But gender is social. It's this set of ideas and symbolic meaning that society has put on the biological categories of male and female. So because you are a woman, you're expected to act like this, or because you are a man, you're expected to act like that. And these are called gender roles. Just a couple of examples here. This is a chart of characteristics traditionally associated with masculinity and femininity. So this is what Western society has decided correlates with men and women, right? Okay, so let's look at the chart here. On the masculine side, we have independence, being assertive, tough, competitive, strong, active, self-confident. And on what's considered feminine is being dependent, emotional, passive, graceful, sensitive, weak, and nurturing. Of course, these are totally unrealistic, arbitrary categories, right? We all have qualities from the masculine side and the feminine side, right? And we're different things at different times. And like I said, these are totally arbitrary, right? Who decided that being competitive or assertive is just masculine, right? Masculinity and femininity, as created by society, is completely blown out of proportion. If you think about it, the goal is almost this unattainable ideal, right? It's one-dimensional. It's this caricature of humanity, totally cartoonish, right? So if you're a man, you're supposed to look like Arnold, huge muscles, very tough. And if you are a woman, you are Barbie, literally the, ideal size, that if she was actually a real life human being, she wouldn't even be able to walk, right? Because her waist is so small, she wouldn't have organs. Her legs are so long that she would just teeter over. So this masculinity and femininity is the human form, to the nth degree, right? The most cartoonish, extreme version, right? And further, it's not just the divide between masculinity and femininity, right? It's the fact that one is elevated or privileged above the other, right? We want to be the characteristics associated with the masculine side, right? To be strong, independent, confident people, right? Not passive or weak. which is considered feminine, right? I don't think I have to convince the women in the room about the beauty ideals and the media and the perfection that we're supposed to try to attain. But guys, you have it bad too. Masculinity imposes similar kinds of pressure, right? Not to be emotional, to keep it all in, not to get help if you need it, to man up, right? Constantly having to prove your masculinity, right? One other thing I'd like to highlight is the performance of gender, the performativity of gender. And what's interesting, this actually comes from an advertisement trying to show what gender is. These two images are of the same woman, but in this picture, she's performing what would be considered a masculine kind of face, right? This is her modeling masculinity, right? And this is a photo, right, that would highlight feminine types of advertisements, right? Kind of this gentle look, this subtle opening of the lips, right? Let's continue. So, these characteristics and these limitations that we brought up on the chart just a couple of slides ago, they're not just descriptive, right? They actually create a system wherein masculinity is privileged over femininity. There's this social hierarchy, right? And it's called the patriarchy. So what happens here is that women and men, all people, tend to put higher values on stuff associated with masculinity. And this means that men tend to be valued more than women. For example, men are supposed to be assertive and confident, right? But women who are assertive are called bossy. There is a different reaction to a masculine man than what would be considered a masculine woman. So you have very kind of strict categories and strict gender roles that are supposed to be ascribed to, depending on your biological category of sex, right? So the patriarchy, the social hierarchy, right, enforces these specific views of masculinity and femininity. Anything beyond that is considered unnatural or just plain wrong. And like I said, this type of society, called the patriarchy, affects everyone. Men and women are held to certain societal standards. They're normalized. They're considered the norm, right? And if you don't meet these standards, you are not a real man or a real woman. You are the problem, right? So this is what feminists mean when they say that feminism is for everybody. The patriarchy affects both men and women, right? The gender roles for men and women are artificial and totally limiting. And ultimately what this does is it normalizes putting women and minorities in subordinate positions, right? And it leads to widespread systematic discrimination. Speaking of minorities, I'd like to talk about how gender actually intersects with other forms of identity, right? So gender is just one element in the web of oppression. There's this idea called intersectionality, that gender intersects with other forms of oppression. So gender is relational. The ideas and symbolic meaning that society puts on the biological categories of male and female are actually also conditioned by other unequal relationships. For instance, race or class, right? Feminist analyses take this into account, right? This gender plus other axes of identity that condition relationships. So it's more complicated than just gender, right? So this means that different people experience gender in different ways. For example, as Alice Walker explains, the experience of being black and female cannot just be understood only in terms of being black or just in terms of being female, right? Considered independently, but must include these interactions which reinforce each other, right? So if you're a black female, it's not just that you're black, it's not just that you're a woman. It's this experience that are totally connected, right? The same thing is true for a Latino man, right? A First Nations woman, a white woman, an Asian man, right? These people are going to experience gender in different ways. And of course, it can be even further complicated, right? You can have an Asian gay man, right, versus a white gay man, versus a poor white man, versus a Latino man who is differently abled. Let's say he doesn't have use of his legs, right? So you experience life, you experience gender differently because of your race, your class, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your ability, right, and other axes of identity. So it's more complicated, right, than just gender. So gender shapes us, and it also shapes the world we live in. The patriarchal system has created a division in society. It's what's called the division between the public and the private, right? So you see this, especially after the Industrial Revolution, the separation of what's considered the public sphere, right? The sphere of the market and of politics, and what's considered the private sphere, the home. Basically, the home is considered outside of the market, outside of politics, totally separate. By definition, it becomes the opposite of the political. It's actually not political, non-political. And this is not great, as you can see, for example, through some laws and laws of economics. So the laws of the private sphere, of the public sphere, don't apply as clearly in the private sphere. For example, you have in history what's called the English coverture laws. At one point in England, and actually in the US as well, a woman was legally the property of her husband. She had no identity beyond that. First, she was the property of her father, and then the property of her husband. No legal identity within society outside of her father or her husband. Another example, marital rape was legal until the 1970s. So a woman could be raped in her home by her husband, right? The private sphere was considered non-political, but the crime would be prosecuted if it happened in the street or in the hallway, outside of her home, right? Or in the backyard or whatever. So you see this misapplication of laws within the private sphere. So there's obviously this difference in rights, this totally weird separation, right? So it's not just that women are, women decide to be separate from society, right? Women's traditional gender roles keep them within the home. And because the home becomes this sort of non-political sphere, women are afforded different rights and privileges. So it's not this fact that men are more active in the public sphere, but the fact that women are not let in. These gender roles actually structure social relations, and it keeps certain people out. And a really good way to see this is through economics within the gender pay gap. So there is a gender pay gap. Women make less than men, even with the same qualifications, the same experience, the same education. It's a comparison of apples to apples. Take doctors and surgeons. Women earn 71% of men's wages. And again, this is controlling for age, race, hours, and education. This is the same thing, apples to apples. Women who are financial specialists make 66% of what men in the same occupation earn. Women who are lawyers and judges who have the exact same education and experience make 82%. The pay gap results from traditional gender roles. We have a specific idea of what a worker is supposed to be, and if it's not a woman, she's going to make less. She's going to be considered less valuable. And it's even worse when you consider race, right? a Caucasian woman earns less, right? She earns on average 78 cents for a white, compared to what a Caucasian man is making, right? $1. This actually is a little bit outdated. I think it's 79 cents nowadays. Don't spend that all in one place. But if you're an African American woman, you make far less. You make 62 cents on average compared to a white man making $1, right? For every dollar a white man is making, an African American woman is earning 62 cents. And of course, it's even worse for Hispanic women. They make a little over half, right? Again, for the same job, same education, same qualifications. And it boils down to this hierarchy of white masculinity over femininity. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. We're not going to blame men, right? It's about what society values. A woman's work is considered less value. Her contributions are considered less value. And a woman of color's work is even less valued, as we can see here. Something I do also want to highlight, this doesn't mean, this gender pay gap does not come from women spending time outside of the workforce due to having kids or raising kids. There was actually a study done, hold on a second, that analyzed a group of full-time workers 1 year after college graduation. So this is literally, they're 22 years old, about 100% of them do not have children, right? They just graduated. And women were paid 82% of what their male counterparts were paid. Again, this is 1 year after college. Nobody has kids yet. It's almost in anticipation of kids, you could say. But regardless, kids were not involved yet. Women did not at that point, the women in the study did not exit the workforce to, have or raise children. This is way before that. So it's something interesting to think about. It's almost, again, this anticipation of children maybe, but if you don't want kids, you're still getting penalized by the fact that you potentially could. So let's consider this then, where we've been talking a lot about feminist values. What is the value added for feminist political science? Well, it shows how gendered ideas have affected the parameters of traditional or mainstream research topics, right? How we study issues. That's what feminist political science can add, right? So I have an example here of international politics. So the traditional idea of security from war is pretty narrowly military, right? You think about when you're thinking about security, you're thinking about how many guns do we have? How big is the military, right? What are the nuclear capabilities? How well protected are we as a country compared to country X or Y or Z, right? But the feminist idea of security, which again is something that feminist international relations studies, the feminist idea of security is affected by domestic violence, rape, poverty, gender subordination, even ecological destruction. These are all as important as the danger from war, right? Thinking about, right, poverty, right? A country that is poorer has a tendency to go into, devolve into more conflictual situations. If you have ecological destruction, you're going to affect the resources available to a country, which may encourage it to invade its neighbor, right? There's so many ways to sort of apply different lenses to expand this idea of security, right? And especially for feminist research, what is considered personal or private or the home, all of these are political. They're not outside of politics. So generally, feminist political science asks different questions. What issues are important? Whose lives are relevant or important in the study? What are traditional perspectives missing? Can we really see security from war without considering poverty, right, or domestic violence? So ultimately, the point of feminist analysis is not to add women into the mix, right, but to uncover how we create the society that we live in the hopes of working towards equality and freedom for all people, to make their own choices, to be paid the same amount for the same work, to be able to walk home at night from work without worry. So how do we do gender analysis? Well, we put on these glasses, let's say, if we're going to be cheesy and metaphorical, that make certain power relationships visible, right? It's about understanding and realizing what is foregrounded, what is backgrounded, what is put kind of on the back burner that we should be looking at more closely, what's relevant, right? So when we're studying history, do we consider all of the individuals? When we study economics, do we incorporate the value that domestic work provides, which is often not included? When we study political science, let's say some specific policy, do we think about the different effects it will have on people of color, on women, on people in lesser socioeconomic positions? It's sort of an expansion of the perspectives, right? What's important? Let's question our assumptions because we might be missing something really big and important. So just for this part of the lecture, just sort of a summary, there is no one type of feminism. It is totally a spectrum, right? There's space for everybody, and of course, anyone can be a feminist. If you believe that we all should be equal, that someone's gender or their class or ethnicity shouldn't keep them from the same opportunities as you, that means you're a feminist, right? And there's really no reason not to be a feminist. It's about basic human rights, period. As MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. once eloquently proposed, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? Okay, so let's move on to the women's rights movement. Now that we have this, we have a pretty good understanding of modern feminism and some of the basic ideas, let's go back into history and highlight some of the key points in the early women's rights movement. So like African Americans and other minorities, women on the whole could not vote, right? Some of the states allowed it for certain local elections. Some of the states out west did, but all in all, there was no universal right to vote for women. Of course, that was not all, but that was sort of the main focus of the first wave of the women's rights movement, right? Mainly focused on suffrage meaning the right to vote, right? And the second wave, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides, was kind of more focused on economic and social freedom, sort of the expansion of okay, so now we have the legal rights, we have the right to vote, let's continue on. We'll also talk about how women's participation in the First and Second World War actually influenced a lot of the second wave, which is really interesting. So I want to play for you this video. It's called Crash Course. It's by John Green. He's really awesome. It's from YouTube. It's from his channel. But he has a really good introduction to this. I recommend a lot of his videos. So let's go ahead and watch this to get a good introduction of the women's rights movement, the first wave.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about Wonder Women. Mr. Green, finally we get to the history of the United States as seen through the lens of Marvel comic superheroes. Oh, me from the past, you sniveling little idiot. Wonder Woman is from the DC universe. Also, this is the study of history, which means a constant re-examination and redefinition of what it means to be a hero, and in the case of this episode, it's about taking the first steps toward acknowledging that not all heroes worthy of historical recognition are men. So we're going to talk about how women transformed pre-Civil War America as they fought to improve prisons, schools, decrease public drunkenness, and end slavery. And while fighting for change and justice for others, American women discovered that the prisoners, children, and slaves they were fighting for weren't the only people being oppressed and marginalized in the American democracy. lived lives much like those of their European counterparts. They were legally and socially subservient to men and trapped within a patriarchal structure. Lower and working class women were actually more equal to men of their own classes, but only because they were equally poor. As usual, it all comes back to economics. In general, throughout world history, the higher the social class, the greater the restrictions on women. Although high-class women have traditionally had the lowest mortality rates, which is one of the benefits of, doors and extra lifeboats and whatnot. So at least you get to enjoy that oppression for many years. As previously noted, American women did participate in the American Revolution, but they were still expected to marry and have kids rather than, pursue a career. Under the legal principle of coverture, actually, husbands held authority over the person, property, and choices of their wives. Also, since women weren't permitted to own property, and property ownership was a precondition for voting, they were totally shut out of the political process. Citizens of the new republic were therefore definitionally male, but women did still improve their status via the ideology of republican motherhood. Women were important to the new republic because they were raising children, especially male children, who would become the future voters, legislators, and honorary doctors of America. So women couldn't themselves participate in the political process, but they needed to be educated some because they were going to potty train those who would later participate in the political process. What's that? There were no potties? Really? Apparently, instead of potties, they had typhoid. Actually, it was a result of not having potties. So even living without rights in a pottyless nation, the Republican mother idea allowed women access to education so that they could teach their children. Also, women, provided they weren't slaves, were counted in determining the population of a state for representation purposes, so that was at least an acknowledgement that they were 5/5 human. And then the market revolution had profound effects on American women too, because as production shifted from homes to factories, it shifted away from women doing the producing. This led to the so-called cult of domesticity, which, like most cults, I am opposed to. That's right, Stan, I'm opposed to the Blue Oyster Cult, the cult of personality by In Living Color, and the 3 remaining Shakers. Sorry, Shakers. But who are we kidding? You're not watching. You're too busy dancing. The cult of domesticity decreed that a woman's place was in the home. So rather than making stuff, the job of women was to enable their husbands to make stuff by providing food and a clean living space, but also by providing what our favorite historian Eric Foner called non-market values like love, friendship, and mutual obligation, which is the way we talk about puppies these days. And indeed, that's in line with actual story titles from early 19th century American women's magazines like Woman, A Being to Come Home To, and Woman, Man's Best Friend. Oh, it's time for the mystery documents? I hope it's from Woman, Man's Best Friend. The rules here are simple. I either get the author of the mystery document right, okay there, Eagle, or I get shocked. Let's see what we got. Woman is to win everything by peace and love, by making herself so much respected, esteemed, and loved that to yield to her opinions and to gratify her wishes will be the free will offering of the heart. But the moment woman begins to feel the promptings of ambition or the thirst for power, her aegis of defense is gone. All the sacred protection of religion, all the generous promptings of chivalry, all the poetry of romantic gallantry depend upon woman's retaining her place as dependent and defenseless, and making no claims and maintaining no right but what are the gifts of honor, rectitude, and love. Well, it was definitely a dude, and I have no idea which dude, so I'm just going to guess John C. Calhoun because he's a bad person. No? Well, what can you do? It wasn't a dude! It was apparently Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister Catherine, who was an education reformer and yet held all of those opinions, so I assume Stan brought up Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister to point out that it wasn't just men who bought into the cult of domesticity. The idea of true equality between men and women was so radical that almost no one embraced it. Despite the economic growth associated with the market economy, women's opportunities for work were very limited. Only very low-paying work was available to them, and in most states they couldn't control their own wages if they were married. But still, poor women did find work in factories or as domestic servants or seamstresses. Some middle-class women found work in that most disreputable of fields, teaching. But the cult of domesticity held that a respectable middle-class woman should stay at home. The truth is, most American women had no chance to work for profit outside their houses. So many women found work outside traditional spheres in reform movements. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. Reform movements were open to women partly because if women were supposed to be the moral center of the home, they could also claim to be the moral conscience of the nation. Thus, it didn't seem out of the ordinary for women to become active in the movement to build asylums for the mentally ill, for instance, as Dorothea Dix was, or to take the lead in sobering the men of America. Many of the most famous advocates for legally prohibiting the sale of alcohol and bottom of a glass or at the end of a beer hose. And by the way, yes, there were bars that allowed you to drink as much beer as you could from a hose for a nickel. Today, these establishments are known as frat houses. These temperance lectures would tell of men spending all their hard-earned money on drink, leading wives and children. There were always children starving and freezing because in the world of the temperance lecture, it was always winter. Now, don't get me wrong, prohibition was a disaster because one, freedom, and two, it's the only time we had to amend the Constitution to be like, just kidding about that other amendment. But it's worth remembering that back then people drank way more than we do now, and also that alcohol is probably a greater public health issue than some recreational drugs that remain illegal. But regardless, the temperance movement made a huge difference in American life because eventually male and female supporters of temperance realized that women would be a more powerful ally against alcohol if they could vote. Thanks, Thoughtful. So in 1928, critic Gilbert Seldes wrote that if prohibition had existed in 1800, the suffragists might have remained for another century a scattered group of intellectual cranks. And to quote another historian, the most urgent reasons for women to want to vote in the mid-1800s were alcohol-related. They wanted the saloons closed down or at least regulated. They wanted the right to own property and to shield their family's financial security from the profligacy of drunken husbands. They wanted the right to divorce those men and to have them arrested for wife-beating and to protect children from being terrorized by them. To do all these things, they needed to change the laws that consigned married women to the status of chattel, and to change those laws, they needed the vote. Many women were also important contributors to the anti-slavery movement, although they tended to have more subordinate roles, like abolitionist Maria Stewart was the first African-American woman to lecture to mixed male and female audiences. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the terrible but very important Uncle Tom's Cabin. Sarah and Angela Grimke, daughters of a South Carolina slaveholder, converted to Quakerism and became outspoken critics of slavery. Sarah Grimke even published the Letters on the Equality of the Sexes in 1838, which is pretty much what the title suggests. By the way, Stan, you could have made Sarah Grimke's letters the mystery document. I would have gotten that. But I want to say one more thing about Harriet Beecher Stowe. There's a reason we read Uncle Tom's Cabin in history classes and not in literature ones. But Uncle Tom's Cabin introduced millions of Americans to the idea that African-American people were people. At least to 19th century readers, Uncle Tom's Cabin humanized slaves to such a degree that it was banned throughout most of the South. So many women involved in the abolitionist movement, when studying slavery, noticed that there was something a little bit familiar. Now, some male abolitionists, notably Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, became supporters of women's rights, but ultimately the male leaders of the anti-slavery movement denied women's demands for equality, believing that any calls for women's rights would undermine the cause of abolition. And they may have had a point, because slavery only existed in parts of the country, whereas women existed in all of it. In fact, one of the arguments used by pro-slavery forces was that equality under the law for male slaves might lead to a slippery slope ending with, like, equality for women. And out of this emerging consciousness of their own subordinate position, the movement for women's rights was born. The most visible manifestation of it was the issue of women's suffrage, raised most eloquently at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and many others wrote and published the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled very closely on the Declaration of Independence. Except in some ways, this declaration was much more radical than the Declaration of Independence because it took on the entire patriarchal structure. Okay, so there are three things I want to quickly point out about the 19th century movement for women's rights. First, like abolitionism, it was an international movement. Often, American feminists traveled abroad to find allies, prefiguring the later transatlantic movement of other advocates for social justice, like Florence Kelley and W.E.B. Du Bois. Secondly, for the most part, like other reform movements, the women's movement was primarily a middle-class or even upper-class effort. Most of the delegates at Seneca Falls, for instance, were from the middle class. There were no representatives of, like, cotton mills. But this didn't mean that 19th century feminists didn't acknowledge the needs of working women. Like Sojourner Truth, probably the most famous black woman abolitionist, spoke eloquently of the plight of working-class women, especially slaves, since she'd been one until 1827. And other women recognized that women needed to be able to participate in the market economy to gain some economic freedom. Now, of course, all the women who wrote about the moral evils of 19th century America, or spoke out, or took hatchets to saloons, were doing what we would now recognize as work. But they were not being paid. Amelia Bloomer got paid, though, because she recognized that it was impossible for women to easily participate in economic activities because of their crazy clothes. So she popularized a new kind of clothing featuring a loose-fitting tunic, trousers, and eponymous undergarments. But then Bloomer and her pants were ridiculed in the press and in the streets, and this brings up the third important thing to remember about the 19th century women's movement. It faced strong resistance. Patriarchy, like the Force, is strong, which is why Luke and Yoda and Darth Vader and Obi-Wan and whoever Samuel Jackson were all dudes. By up and not Princess Leia, who was cooler and had more to fight for and was less screwed up. Patriarchy. Many women's rights advocates were fighting to overturn not just laws, but also attitudes. Some of those goals, such as claiming greater control over the right to regulate their own sexual activity and whether or not to have children, were twisted by critics to claim that women advocated free love. It's interesting to note that the United States ended slavery more than 50 years before it granted women the right to vote, and that although much of the march toward equality between the sexes has been slow and steady, the Equal Rights Amendment, despite being passed by Congress, was never ratified. But by taking leading roles in the reform movements of the 19th century, not just when it came to temperance and slavery, but also prisons and asylums, women were able to enter the public sphere for the first time. And these great women changed the world, for better and for worse, just as great men do. And along the way, they made the women question part of the movement for social reform in the United States. And in doing so, American women chipped away at the idea that a woman's place must be in the home. That might not have been a presidential election or a war, but it is still bringing real change to our real lives on a daily basis. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
Okay, so that was a good highlight of the first wave. Moving on historically, your book claims that not much else went on politically for women after 1920, after women gained the right to vote. But this is not actually 100% true. Especially during the Second World War, there was a lot of dramatic change in the social and economic roles of women. So before Pearl Harbor, more than 80% of American men and women thought it was wrong for wives to work outside of the home if their husbands were employed. Schools actually refused to hire women if they were married and fired them if they did get married. The federal government actually prohibited by law the employment of two members of the same family in civil service. But during the war, when men left to fight, their jobs were open and they needed to be filled by people who were left, and that was mostly women. Now, suddenly, women became the secret weapons of democracy's arsenal, as one ad put it. Women power, the key to victory against fascism. And those who had been told just a few years earlier that they were actually threatening the nation's survival by taking jobs away from men were actually now encouraged to rush to the workplace as part of their sacred patriotic duty. Women also did work that they were not allowed to do before. Rosie the Riveter here was the emblem, right? Welding, driving ambulances, working assembly lines in factories, working in offices, on cranes, cleaning blast furnaces. Women became lumberjacks. A ton of stuff that was completely cut off to them previously. Before the war in 1939, 136 women were involved in ship construction. 3 years later, the figure was 160,000. During the war, the female labor force increased by more than 6 million. So again, complete 180 on the propaganda of a woman's quote-unquote proper place, at least temporarily. During the war, women knew no bounds. Afterwards, when their work was no longer considered necessary, there unfortunately was a change in the propaganda. Now there's another 180. Instead of encouraging women to work, the idea was to go back to the home, right? And give back the jobs to the men returning from war. And this is where you get this idea of the perfect 1950s housewife. But women had learned a new way of living, right? Not only having interesting and difficult work that they excelled in, allowing them to realize their abilities and their competence outside of what was expected of them, but also the improvement of their economic situations. Those jobs that I mentioned earlier, the ambulance driving, the working on cranes and factories, those jobs had higher pay. And sometimes 40% more than non-defense work. And since those were no longer off limits to women, they could take advantage of this. So women wanted to keep their jobs. More than 75% of them said that they intended to keep their jobs after the war ended. But like I mentioned, things changed, right? Jobs were reverted back to being off limits to women. Women were relegated to lesser paying and less skilled jobs, or flat out fired, and more or less forced to go back into the home and leave their jobs. But women, for that short time period, had learned what it was like to have a different life. Some may have chosen the domestic family life and had been happy with it, but others wanted something else. So this is, it played a huge role in spurring on the second wave. The 1950s were a really formative time for feminism and the women's movement. Simone de Beauvoir was a French writer who published The Second Sex, a revolutionary book that analyzes history through a feminist lens. It is considered one of the masters of the 20th century philosophy. She proposes that women are characterized as the opposite to men, kind of what we were talking about in terms of masculinity and femininity being like opposed, right? Totally artificial, right? But she explains how this relationship was created in history to keep women as the quote-unquote other, right? She also refutes biological claims that it's just natural, and shows how these myths were created from this falsehood to limit people. Those kinds of limitations, right? The saying that women are weaker or dumber or whatever is not biological. It's totally socially created by people. And so she kind of highlights that, especially doing this kind of historical analysis. Very interesting. I highly, highly recommend that book. In 1963, inspired by Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique. She was trying to figure out why women seemed unhappy, why her survey of her fellow Smith College graduates at their 15th reunion were so negative. Why were they so unhappy with their lives as housewives? She did research in psychology, media, and advertisement, and explained what she called the problem with no name, this widespread trend of unhappy women. Especially in the 1950s, there was this unspoken, or maybe spoken, I guess, if you could say that, but this sort of ideal being pushed that women could only be fulfilled by marriage and kids and housewifery, that wanting a career or something different meant that you are weird or masculine or neurotic, that you were, quote unquote, rejecting the path of normal femininity. And of course, she sort of highlights that and asks, why is this the case? What is this proper place? And suggests this idea that there can be more to life than marriage and motherhood. And this book is widely regarded as one of the most influential nonfiction books of the 20th century, and it's credited with sparking the beginning of the second wave of feminism in the United States. Based on the feelings that many women had after World War II, and building on that, right, Friedan and others in 1966 created the National Organization for Women, NOW. So the movement gained speed, and by the late 1960s and 70s, women's liberation emerges as a major social force. So, like I mentioned earlier, first wave feminism focused on suffrage, right, voting rights, and overturning legal obstacles to gender equality, right, voting rights, property rights, those kind of things. Second wave feminism broadened the issues to include sexuality, family, the workplace, reproductive rights, and de facto inequalities, right? Remember, we talked about this. The legal obstacles may be gone, but you still have de facto discrimination, right? Those sort of learned social and cultural things that limit people, right? Even after laws are gone, right? Just because you could vote doesn't mean that sexism is gone overnight, right? Your book very much incorrectly characterizes wage discrimination. I wanted to highlight this. It's not about comparing construction workers and nurses. It's about apples to apples comparisons, right? People in the exact same job with the exact same education and experience earning different wages. So we want to instead compare male nurses and female nurses, right? So the combination of the Equal Pay Act and the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act was supposed to have this comprehensive ban on discrimination. So the Equal Pay Act of 1963 abolished wage disparity based on sex, right? You could not, for instance, give some employees health insurance and not others. You couldn't give some pensions and not others. It had to be an equal distribution, as well as wages, right? And then you also have the Title VII, right? This extended the barring of discrimination to include policies, hiring and firing, promotion, all that stuff, to include race, religion, and national origin. So again, it's about the same job. For example, Suzanne works at a reservations agent for an airline. About half of the other reservation agents in her office are men, who are typically paid $1 more than Suzanne and the other female agents. Not legal, right? The company has established a dress code for female reservation agents, but not for male agents. Also not legal. And here I have this, I have it color coded based on what the Equal Pay Act is referring to and what Title VII is referring to. So paying the male agents $1 more than the female agents is illegal as of the Equal Pay Act of 1963. And then the other example here, having a dress code for some of the agents and not others, here related to gender, is illegal as of 1964 of the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, there is an allowance of a pay difference between people in the same job if the pay difference is based on seniority or some other sort of merit system, right? If someone has been in the job 10 years longer than someone else, of course you don't have to pay them the same amount, right? Or if they're doing a really better job, let's say you're in sales and this person is selling their butts off, right? Like they have, 10 or 15 more credits of sales than the other salesperson. Of course, you can pay that person more, right? But it has to be based on seniority or merit, right? You can't pay them more because they're a man or because they're white. And it has to be proven, right? There has to be some sort of, actual facts, right? There has to be some sort of, I can't think of the word. Whatever. There has to be proven, right? You have to have some sort of, okay. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits gender-based discrimination, and this also extends to sexual harassment. And this is anything from requesting or requiring sexual favors or acts in exchange of job opportunities, promotions, anything like that, as well as hostile work environments. So this means if someone is using sexual innuendo or being inappropriate in the workplace, if it interferes with an employee's ability to do their jobs, that's totally illegal. You cannot do that. That's part of sexual harassment. It's illegal to create an intimidating or hostile or offensive environment. And that is anything from sexual innuendo, for example, to racial slurs. And it goes, of course, either way for men and women. Title IX prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any federally funded education program or activity. This is public or private institutions based on whether or not they are receiving federal funding. So, for example, Title IX requires that women and men be provided equitable opportunities to participate in sports, right? You don't have to offer identical sports. You don't have to have like a women's football league, but you have to have an equal opportunity to play, right? There has to be there has to be equal opportunity, right? Or in terms of scholarships, right? They have to have, right, female and male student athletes have to receive athletic scholarship dollars proportional to their participation. And then there's other sort of benefits in terms of scheduling of games, practice times, coaching, locker rooms, right? You have to have a women's and men's locker room. There has to be facilities for both, medical and training facilities, all those other things, a ton of stuff there. It doesn't require, again, identical athletic programs or the same funds to be spent, but just proportionate to participation. Let's move on to discrimination based on sexuality. I want to play this video about the top 5 myths about LGBT non-discrimination laws to highlight a couple of things I want to talk about.
It's 2014, but federal law still doesn't prohibit discrimination against LGBT people in housing, employment, or public accommodations. As a result, state and local governments across the country have started enacting their own anti-LGBT discrimination laws. In the past year alone, cities like San Antonio, Atlantic Beach, Fayetteville, and Houston have all enacted ordinances banning discrimination against gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And each time, conservatives have made the same bogus arguments against protecting LGBT people from discrimination. Here now are the 5 most popular myths about LGBT non-discrimination laws debunked. Myth number 1. LGBT people aren't actually discriminated against anymore.
Discrimination has not been shown, and the need for this ordinance has not been proven.
Fundamentally, we think it's unnecessary. There's no emergency as such as there are claims of any discrimination.
We work harmoniously with each other. We have not had any specific instances of why this is a problem.
Another version of this argument is that the free market discourages discrimination against gay people. It's a nice story, but it's a lie. Studies have found that nearly half of all LGBT people will experience some form of employment discrimination in their lifetime. A recent study by the Department of Housing and Urban Development found widespread discrimination against same-sex couples in housing. And the situation is even worse for the transgender community, which faces astronomical rates of discrimination and harassment. Myth number 2. Non-discrimination laws create special rights for LGBT people.
They want special rights, but in doing so, they stifle the rights of Christians.
They don't have to prove that if they evicted or fired me that I was a heterosexual white man. They don't have to do any of that. So this is special rights.
The Employment Non-Discrimination Act. This is not about, as they couch it, equal rights. It's about special rights.
No, it's not. Non-discrimination laws typically just give LGBT people the same protections that already exist for other marginalized groups, like African Americans, women, and people with disabilities. In cities like San Antonio and Fayetteville, for example, the city government just added the phrases sexual orientation and gender identity to the existing list of groups protected by the city's non-discrimination law. These special rights are identical to the protections that already are offered for race, sex, and religion in federal law. Myth number 3. Non-discrimination laws infringe on the religious liberty of Christians.
A new non-discrimination ordinance in San Antonio, Texas, could be used to discriminate against Christians.
This is a broader anti-religion effort. It legalizes discrimination against Christians.
So, does this wind up being a case of reverse discrimination, potentially?
Gross and wrong. Non-discrimination laws historically include exemptions for religious organizations like churches. No church in America has ever been forced to serve or hire LGBT people, and they never will be. The First Amendment protects anti-LGBT speech and beliefs, and federal law already prohibits discrimination on the basis of religion. Non-discrimination laws are concerned with actions, not just beliefs. So believing gay people are going to hell, allowed. Kicking gay customers out of a restaurant for being gay, not allowed. Believing gay people are worse than alcoholics, allowed. Firing a lesbian employee just for being gay, not allowed. Believing transgender people are abominations, allowed. Denying access to a trans person at a publicly funded homeless shelter, not allowed. Myth number 4. Non-discrimination laws will trigger a wave of frivolous lawsuits.
CAP's communication director, Aaron Baer, says the broadly written ordinance would also result in frivolous lawsuits.
He says the law could leave businesses open to frivolous lawsuits.
If someone comes into their business and says, "Oh, you're making me feel unwelcome," I'm going to bring a lawsuit.
Taken to its extreme, this is an argument for getting rid of all non-discrimination laws, not just ones to protect gay people. People file false lawsuits about race and sex all the time. But you don't legalize discrimination because you're afraid of a few bogus lawsuits, right? Right? More importantly, a 2011 study found that LGBT employment discrimination complaints are historically filed at the same rate as race and sex discrimination complaints, roughly 4 complaints per 10,000 employees. The 2014 study echoed those findings, concluding that, quote, the rate at which LGBT people file complaints under these laws is similar to the rate at which women and people of color file complaints under sex and race non-discrimination laws. Myth 5, and maybe the worst of all, non-discrimination laws let sexual predators sneak into women's restrooms.
But the element that has the ordinance in trouble is the bathroom clause.
if a man decides that he's a woman, he can follow, your young girl, your wife, into the women's restroom.
This is one of the oldest and most popular attacks against LGBT non-discrimination laws. It's scary, it's about kids, and it's really good at getting people to vote against LGBT equality. But it's never, ever been true. Law enforcement officials, human rights workers, and sexual assault victims advocates have dismissed this argument as, quote, beyond specious. In states and cities where non-discrimination laws have been in place for years, experts have found no evidence linking these laws to sexual assault or misconduct in public restrooms. It just doesn't happen. These myths are all meant to scare people into voting against basic legal protections for their LGBT neighbors. And it's important that media outlets put horror stories like this into context. They're nothing new. They're trotted out every time there's a debate about non-discrimination laws, and they never, ever come true.
Okie doke, so that is a highlight of some of the myths about non-discrimination laws. As the video mentioned, same-sex marriage is legal, but there are actually no federal LGBT protections for employment, housing, public accommodations, credit, or education. So I wanted to talk about this through a law introduced in 2015 called the Equality Act that would actually provide an update to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was actually introduced by a Democratic senator and is co-sponsored by some Republicans. So there is some bipartisan support there for this. Because again, there are no federal protections for a lot of these. So this is what the new Equality Act would do. What would it change? Well, for employment, any employer with at least 15 employees would be prohibited from discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. There would be no religious exemption to discriminate against such employees, and all federal employees would be protected under the law as well. In terms of housing, the Fair Housing Act would be amended to ensure that LGBT people could not be denied the sale, rental, or financing of housing. So let's say you're a gay person and you're trying to rent a house or rent an apartment, whatever. Currently, someone could deny that to you. So this would change that. In terms of public accommodations, LGBT people could no longer be denied service in stores, banks, transportation, healthcare services, etc. Public education. So LGBT people would be explicitly protected from discrimination when it comes to federal student financial aid programs. There would also be some changes in federal funding. Any entity that receives federal funds could not be able to discriminate against LGBT people in programs such as healthcare, child welfare, nutritional assistance, public education, and other financial assistance for higher education. In terms of credit, LGBT people could have equal access to credit, and the term spouse would replace references to husband and wife in the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And what's interesting is that this would not just help LGBT people, because equality would refer to all people regardless of gender or race, right? So if this was passed, businesses wouldn't be able to charge women more. For example, there are currently no federal protections on the basis of sex in public accommodations. So in addition to sexual orientation and gender identity, this Equality Act would also add sex to that list of protections as well. So this would ensure that women would have equal access to spaces with the same protection under federal laws that other categories have. So this would mean that a car dealership couldn't charge a woman more than a man just because she's a woman, or a salon couldn't charge men and women different prices for the exact same haircut. Or you wouldn't be able to charge more for something just because it's pink, which is actually the case for a lot of items. For instance, razors. Sex would also be added to the protections for federal financial assistance under Title 11, meaning that women could also secure equal access to public funds. People of color would be protected while hailing a cab, for example. The Equality Act, as I mentioned, updates the federal definition of public accommodations. Currently, some businesses are covered, like hotels, inns, restaurants, theaters, but the legislation would add retail stores, banks, transportation services, healthcare services, among other stuff. So like I mentioned, a person who would be hailing a cab wouldn't be it wouldn't be legal to discriminate against them. There was a pretty famous story a couple months ago about a woman and her daughter who were black hailing a cab, and the cab driver basically told them that he didn't want to pick them up because they were black. That's totally illegal. If you're providing a public service, you cannot discriminate based just on race or color, right? Or, in this case, gender as well as sexual orientation. Now, religious exemptions would be maintained, but they would be kept narrow. So nothing in this Equality Act would change the exemptions for religious organizations and schools that already make decisions based on religious identity, right? So if you have like a Christian school, they can still hire according to their, religious identity, right? But it would specify that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act could not be invoked in an attempt to justify discrimination that would otherwise be covered. So that would ensure that religion couldn't be used to refuse service on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. So thinking about this, I believe this is your response paper and discussion post topic. Let's consider some of these ideas when we think about discrimination. So, like we said, same-sex marriage is legal, but people still mistreat gay individuals. In the majority of states in the U.S., people are at risk for being fired, evicted, or refused service just because they're not straight. For example, in Texas, a gay couple was asked to leave a restaurant because, quote, "we don't serve fags here," end quote. Another example, a Michigan pediatrician refused to treat a lesbian couple's baby because they were, homosexual. I linked this video on your response paper if you'd like to check it out. So thinking about this, what if we switched out the word gay with female or white or Asian or black or Latino? If someone was refused service because they were black or Jewish or white, that would not be okay, right? Let's consider these things. Courts have already decided on some limits on religious freedom, right? So it's illegal to discriminate on race because of your religious beliefs. So if you are a religious and racist restaurant owner, you cannot refuse service to, for example, an Asian couple because they are Asian, or a black couple because they are black. So why isn't this extended to people with a different sexuality? Do religious freedom and freedom of identity clash? How does liberty play a role here? Where do we draw the line, right? So again, let's consider some of these questions and themes within your response papers and talk about them in our discussion posts. I'm going to leave you here. As always, any questions, please don't hesitate.